Morning, all. The Senate Armed Services Committee meets this morning to receive testimony on the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2017 budget request, the associated future years defense program, and the posture of U.S. Armed Forces. We welcome our witnesses. We thank each of you for your service to our nation and to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines serving here at home and around the world. Before I proceed with my statement, let me just say that yesterday, disturbing statements made by a senior executive of the United Launch Alliance were reported in the media. These statements raised troubling questions about the nature of the relationship between the Department of Defense and ULA. This committee treats with the utmost seriousness any implication that the department showed favoritism to a major defense contractor or that efforts have been made to silence members of Congress. Mr. Secretary, I expect that you will make a full investigation into these statements and take action wherever appropriate. Last month, the Director of National Intelligence provided this committee a candid and unsettling picture of our worldwide threats. Just consider what has occurred over the past 5 years. While al-Qaeda remains a real and potent threat, the vanguard of global terrorism is increasingly led by ISIL, which has metastasized across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, and which has already launched attacks into the heart of Europe and inspired an attack here in the United States. Russia has invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, menaced our NATO allies, intervened militarily in Syria, and is now regarded by Chairman Dunford and many of our military leaders say as our nation's greatest threat. China has continued its rapid military modernization, steadily militarized the South China Sea, and used coercion and the threat of force to bully our Asian allies and partners. North Korea has launched brazen cyber attacks against the United States, continued to advance and test its nuclear weapons program, and conducted provocative missile tests, including a potential ICBM capability. Rather than moderating its malign activities in the Middle East, as advocates of the nuclear agreement predicted, Iran has instead increased its support for its terrorist proxies from Syria to Yemen, conducted advanced missile tests in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and fired rockets near a U.S. aircraft carrier. More recently, Iran seized 2 U.S. Navy vessels, detained 10 U.S. sailors, and propagandized the entire incident in total violation of international law and centuries of maritime tradition. These are the growing threats we face in the world, and yet the Department of Defense remains guided by a strategy that predates all of these developments. It is based on assumptions about the world that no longer apply. What's worse, the same is true about our nation's defense spending. While the requirements for our military have grown, the Budget Control Act arbitrarily capped defense spending back in 2011. Despite periodic relief from these caps, each of our military services remain undersized, unready, and underfunded to meet the current and future threats. This translates into real things that our military, as remarkable and determined as it is, simply cannot do for our nation. Our aircraft carriers no longer provide constant presence in the Middle East or the Western Pacific. Just 1/3 of Army brigade combat teams are ready to deploy and operate decisively. The Air Force is the smallest it's ever been, and more than half of its squadrons are not combat mission ready. Marine Corps Aviation is in crisis, and the Assistant Commandant testified this week that his forces cannot execute our nation's defense strategy. The effects on the present force are bad enough. The effects on the future force are worse. Years and years of deferred maintenance and delayed modernization are creating a mountain of bills that will soon come due. From 2018 to 2021 alone, the Department of Defense needs $100 billion above the BCA caps just to meet current requirements. In reality, those requirements are inadequate, additional resources will be needed, and the longer we try to delay that bill, the bigger and worse it gets, and the more we run the risk of return to sequestration. This is a crisis of our own making, and I'm speaking of the Congress as well, and it is why many of us are so concerned about the President's budget request for fiscal year 2017. There's a lot to like about this request. Many of the investments, especially related to the so-called third offset strategy, are critical and long overdue. That said, though our nation is asking our military to do more over the next fiscal year, the President's defense budget request in real dollars is actually less than it is this year. As a result, the Department was forced to cut $17 billion it said it needed last year purely for budget reasons. To be sure, the temporary effects of more positive economic assumptions and lower fuel prices softened the blow. Nevertheless, the Department cut over $10 billion in real military capability to mitigate this shortfall. Nothing in the Bipartisan Budget Act prevented the President from requesting more than he did. He did not have to fund our growing operational requirements by cutting modernization and procurement. He chose to do so. And these are just some of the consequences. The Army had to cut 24 UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters. The Air Force had to cut 5 F-35As this year and 45 over the next 4 years. The Navy plans to lay up an additional 5 Ticonderoga-class cruisers. The Marine Corps cut 77 Joint Light Tactical Vehicles, $1.3 billion in military construction, and family housing has been cut. And certain critical nuclear modernization efforts, including an ICBM replacement and the B-61 nuclear bomb tail kit, have been further delayed. The unfunded requirements of the military services now total nearly $18 billion. That represents the additional ships, airplanes, helicopters, fighting vehicles, training, and other programs that our military leaders say they need simply to carry out our increasingly antiquated defense strategy at an acceptable level of risk. Last year, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, described the future year's defense plan as, quote, the lower ragged edge of manageable risk in our ability to execute the defense strategy. And now here we are 1 year later and $17 billion less than what our military needed and planned for. I do not know what lies beneath the, quote, lower ragged edge of manageable risk, but this is what I fear it means, that our military is becoming less and less able to deter conflict, and if God forbid, deterrence does fail somewhere and we end up in conflict, our nation will deploy young Americans into battle without sufficient training or equipment to fight a war that will take longer, be larger, cost more, and ultimately claim more American lives than it otherwise would have. This is the growing risk we face, and we can't change course soon enough. We should not threaten the stability provided by the Bipartisan Budget Act. We should build on it, and therefore, we make a virtue out of stability. Let's recall, this budget agreement ends this year, and defense spending over the next 4 years is capped by a law at $100 billion less than what our witnesses will testify our military needs. That kind of stability is not the answer. It is the problem. And if we cut into our military muscle again this year, our looming budget problems just get worse. Finally, another priority of this committee will remain the defense reform effort that we began last year, including a review of the Goldwater-Nichols legislation that is now marking its 30th anniversary. Over the past year, Senator Reid and his staff and I and my staff, we've held hearings and conducted interviews with dozens of former and currently serving military and civilian defense leaders, including discussions with our distinguished witness today. The result is that I believe we have a rather clear definition of the challenge that we all must address. The focus of Goldwater-Nichols was operational effectiveness, improving our military's ability to fight as a joint force. The challenge today is strategic integration. By that I mean improving the ability of the Department of Defense to develop strategies and integrate military power globally to confront a series of threats, both states and non-state actors, all of which span multiple regions of the world and numerous military functions. Put simply, our competitors are catching up, and our defense organization must be far more agile and innovative than it is. As the committee considers what steps may be necessary to improve our defense organization, we are committed to work closely with both of you, and we would welcome any thoughts and recommendations you are prepared to share today. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very